This audiobook edition of Jawaharlal Nehru's The Discovery of India, first published in 1946, is brought to you by Giribala Joshi. This short YouTube podcast is a part of a larger project. Please subscribe to the channel and like and share my videos. This series is created with the help of advanced text-to-speech AI technology.
Chapter 5, Through the Ages. Part 16, Indian Colonies and Culture in Southeast Asia. To know and understand India, one has to travel far in time and space, to forget for a while her present condition with all its misery and narrowness and horror, and to have glimpses of what she was and what she did. To know my country, wrote Rabindranath Tagore, one has to travel to that age, when she realized her soul and thus transcended her physical boundaries, when she revealed her being in a radiant magnanimity which illumined the eastern horizon, making her recognized as their own by those in alien shores who were awakened into a surprise of life, and not now when she has withdrawn herself into a narrow barrier of obscurity, into a miserly pride of exclusiveness, into a poverty of mind that dumbly revolves around itself in an unmeaning repetition of a past that has lost its light and has no message for the pilgrims of the future. One has not only to go back in time but to travel, in mind if not in body, to various countries of Asia, where India spread out in many ways, leaving immortal testimony of her spirit, her power, and her love of beauty. How few of us know of these great achievements of our past, how few realize that if India was great in thought and philosophy, she was equally great in action. The history that men and women from India made far from their homeland has still to be written. Most Westerners still imagine that ancient history is largely concerned with the Mediterranean countries, and medieval and modern history is dominated by the quarrelsome little continent of Europe. And still they make plans for the future as if Europe only counted and the rest could be fitted in anywhere. Sir Charles Eliot has written that scant justice is done to India's position in the world by those European histories which recount the exploits of her invaders and leave the impression that her own people were a feeble dreamy folk, sundered from the rest of mankind by their seas and mountain frontiers. Such a picture takes no account of the intellectual conquests of the Hindus. Even their political conquests were not contemptible, and are remarkable for the distance, if not the extent, of the territories occupied. But such military or commercial invasions are insignificant compared with the spread of Indian thought. Footnote, Eliot, in Hinduism and Buddhism, Volume 1, page 12. End of footnote. Eliot was probably unaware, when he wrote, of many recent discoveries in Southeast Asia, which have revolutionized the conception of India's and Asia's past. The knowledge of those discoveries would have strengthened his argument and shown that Indian activities abroad, even apart from the spread of her thought, were very far from being insignificant. I remember when I first read, about 15 years ago, some kind of a detailed account of the history of Southeast Asia, how amazed I was and how excited I became. New panoramas opened out before me, new perspectives of history, new conceptions of India's past, and I had to adjust all my thinking and previous notions to them. Champa, Cambodia, and Angkor, Srivijaya, and Majapahit suddenly rose out of the void, took living shape, vibrant with that instinctive feeling, which makes the past touch the present. Of Shailendra, the mighty man of war and conquest and other achievements, Dr. H. G. Quaritch Wales has written, this great conqueror, whose achievements can only be compared with those of the greatest soldiers known to Western history, and whose fame in his time sounded from Persia to China, in a decade or two built up a vast maritime empire which endured for 5 centuries, and made possible the marvelous flowering of Indian art and culture in Java and Cambodia. Yet in our encyclopedias and histories, one will search in vain for a reference to this far-flung empire or to its noble founder. The very fact of such an empire ever having existed is scarcely known, except by a handful of Oriental scholars. Footnote, from Towards Angkor, published by Harrop, 1937. End of footnote. The military exploits of these early Indian colonists are important as throwing light on certain aspects of the Indian character and genius which have hitherto not been appreciated. But far more important is the rich civilization they built up in their colonies and settlements and which endured for over 1,000 years. During the past quarter of a century a great deal of light has been thrown on the history of this widespread area in Southeast Asia, which is sometimes referred to as Greater India. There are many gaps still, many contradictions, and scholars continue to put forward their rival theories, but the general outline is clear enough, and sometimes there is an abundance of detail. There is no lack of material, for there are references in Indian books, and accounts of Arab travelers and, most important of all, Chinese historical accounts. There are also many old inscriptions, copper plates, etc., and in Java and Bali there is a rich literature based on Indian sources and often paraphrasing Indian epics and myths. Greek and Latin sources have also supplied some information. But, above all, there are the magnificent ruins of ancient monuments, especially at Angkor and Borobudur. Footnote: reference might be made to Dr. R.C. Majumdar's Ancient Indian Colonies in the Far East, published in Calcutta, 1927, and his Swarnadeep, published in Calcutta in 1937. Also to the publications of the Greater India Society, Calcutta. End of footnote. From the 1st century of the Christian era onwards, wave after wave of Indian colonists spread east and southeast, reaching Ceylon, Burma, Malaya, Java, Sumatra, Borneo, Siam, Cambodia, and Indochina. Some of them managed to reach Formosa, the Philippine Islands and Celebes. Even as far as Madagascar. The current language is Indonesian with a mixture of Sanskrit words. It must have taken them several hundred years to spread out in this way, and possibly all of these places were not reached directly from India but from some intermediate settlement. There appear to have been 4 principal waves of colonization from the 1st century AC to about 900 AC, and in between there must have been a stream of people going eastwards. But the most remarkable feature of these ventures was that they were evidently organized by the state. Widely scattered colonies were started almost simultaneously, and almost always the settlements were situated on strategic points and on important trade routes. The names that were given to these settlements were Old Indian names. Thus Cambodia, as it is known now, was called Cambodia, which was a well-known town in ancient India, in Gandhara or the Kabul Valley. This itself indicates roughly the period of this colonization, for at that time Gandhara, Afghanistan, must have been an important part of Aryan India. What led to these extraordinary expeditions across perilous seas, and what was the tremendous urge behind them? They could not have been thought of or organized unless they had been preceded for many generations or centuries by individuals or small groups intent on trade. In the most ancient Sanskrit books there are vague references to these countries of the East. It is not always easy to identify the names given in them, but sometimes there is no difficulty. Java is clearly from Javadvip or the island of millet. Even today Java means barley or millet in India. The other names given in the old books are also usually associated with minerals, metals, or some industrial or agricultural product. This nomenclature itself makes one think of trade. Dr. R.C. Majumdar has pointed out that if literature can be regarded as a fair reflex of the popular mind, trade and commerce must have been a supreme passion in India in the centuries immediately preceding and following the Christian era. All this indicates an expanding economy and a constant search for distant markets. This trade gradually increased in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, and then these adventurous traders and merchants may have been followed by missionaries, for this was just the period after Ashoka. The old stories in Sanskrit contain many accounts of perilous sea voyages and of shipwrecks. Both Greek and Arab accounts show that there was regular maritime intercourse between India and the Far East at least as early as the 1st century AC. The Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian islands lay on the direct trade route between China and India, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean. Apart from their geographical importance, these countries contained valuable minerals, metals, spices, and timber. Malaya was then, as now, famous for its tin mines. Probably the earliest voyages were along the east coast of India, Kalinga, Orissa, Bengal, Burma, and then down the Malay Peninsula. Later the direct sea routes from East and South India were developed. It was along this sea route that many Chinese pilgrims came to India. Fa Shen in the 5th century passed Java and complains that there were many heretics then, meaning people following the Brahminical faith and not Buddhism. It is clear that shipbuilding was a well-developed and flourishing industry in ancient India. We have some details and particulars of the ships built in those days. Many Indian ports are mentioned. South Indian, Andhra, coins of the 2nd and 3rd centuries AC bear the device of a 2-masted ship. The Ajanta frescoes depict the conquest of Ceylon, and ships carrying elephants are shown. The huge states and empires that developed from the original Indian settlements were essentially naval powers interested in trade and, therefore, in the control of the sea routes. They came into conflict with each other on the seas, and at least once one of them challenged the Chola state of South India. But the Cholas were also strong on the seas, and they sent a naval expedition which subdued for a while the Sailendra Empire. There is an interesting Tamil inscription of 1088 AC which refers to a corporation of the 1500. This was apparently a union of traders who were described in it as brave men, born to wander over many countries ever since the beginning of the Cretaceous Age, penetrating the regions of the 6 continents by land and water routes, and dealing in various articles such as horses, elephants, precious stones, perfumes, and drugs, either wholesale or in retail. This was the background of the early colonizing ventures of the Indian people. Trade and adventure and the urge for expansion drew them to these eastern lands, which were comprehensively described in old Sanskrit books as the Svarnabhumi, the land of gold, or as Svarnadvip, the island of gold. The early colonists settled down, more followed, and thus a peaceful penetration went on. There was a fusion of the Indians with the races they found there, and also the evolution of a mixed culture. It was only then, probably, that the political element came from India, some Kshatriya princes, cadets of the noble families, in search of adventure and dominion. It is suggested, from a similarity of names, that many of these people who came were from the widespread Malva tribe in India, hence the Malay race, which has played such an important part in the whole of Indonesia. A part of central India is still known as Malwa. The early colonists are supposed to have gone from Kalinga on the east coast, Orissa, but it was the Hindu Pallava kingdom of the south that made an organized effort at colonization. The Sailendra dynasty, which became so famous in Southeast Asia, is believed to have come from Orissa. At that time Orissa was a stronghold of Buddhism, but the ruling dynasty was Brahminical. All these Indian colonies were situated between 2 great countries and 2 great civilizations, India and China. Some of them, on the Asiatic mainland, actually touched the frontiers of the Chinese Empire, the others were on the direct trade route between China and India. Thus they were influenced by both these countries, and a mixed Indo-Chinese civilization grew up, but such was the nature of these 2 cultures that there was no conflict between the 2, and mixed patterns of different shapes and varying contents emerged. The countries of the mainland, Burma, Siam, Indochina, were more influenced by China. The islands and the Malay Peninsula had more of the impress of India. As a rule, the methods of government and the general philosophy of life came from China, religion and art from India. The mainland countries depended for their trade largely on China, and there were frequent exchanges of ambassadors. But even in Cambodia and in the mighty remains of Angkor, the only artistic influence that has been so far detected came from India. But Indian art was flexible and adaptable, and in each country it flowered afresh and in many new ways, always retaining that basic impress which it derived from India. Sir John Marshall has referred to the amazingly vital and flexible character of Indian art, and he points out how both Indian and Greek art had the common capacity to adapt themselves to suit the needs of every country, race, and religion with which they came into contact. Indian art derives its basic character from certain ideals associated with the religious and philosophic outlook of India. As religion went from India to all these eastern lands, so also went this basic conception of art. Probably the early colonies were definitely Brahminical, and Buddhism spread later. The 2 existed side by side as friends, and mixed forms of popular worship grew up. This Buddhism was chiefly of the Mahayana type, easily adaptable, and both Brahmanism and Buddhism, under the influence of local habits and traditions, had probably moved away from the purity of their original doctrines. In later years there were mighty conflicts between a Buddhist state and a Brahminical state, but these were essentially political and economic wars for control of trade and sea routes. The history of these Indian colonies covers a period of about 1300 years or more, from the early beginnings in the 1st or 2nd century AC to the end of the 15th century. The early centuries are vague and not much is known except that many small states existed. Gradually they consolidate themselves, and by the 5th century great cities take shape. By the 8th century seafaring empires have arisen, partly centralized but also exercising a vague suzerainty over many lands. Sometimes these dependencies became independent and even presumed to attack the central power, and this has led to some confusion in our understanding of those periods. The greatest of these states was the Sailendra Empire, or the Empire of Srivijaya, which became the dominant power both on sea and land in the whole of Malaysia by the 8th century. This was till recently supposed to have its origin and capital in Sumatra, but later researches indicate that it began in the Malay Peninsula. At the height of its power it included Malaya, Ceylon, Sumatra, part of Java, Borneo, Celebes, the Philippines, and part of Formosa, and probably exercised suzerainty over Cambodia and Champa, Annam. It was a Buddhist empire. But long before the Sailendra dynasty had established and consolidated this empire, powerful states had grown up in Malaya, Cambodia, and Java. In the northern part of the Malay Peninsula, near the borders of Siam, extensive ruins, says R.J. Wilkinson, point to the past existence of powerful states and a high standard of wealth and luxury. In Champa, Annam, there was the city of Pondarangam in the 3rd century, and in the 5th century Cambodia became a great city. A great ruler, Jayavarman, united the smaller states in the 9th century and built up the Cambodian Empire with its capital at Angkor. Cambodia was probably under the suzerainty of the Sailendras from time to time, but this must have been nominal, and it reasserted its independence in the 9th century. This Cambodian state lasted for nearly 400 years under a succession of great rulers and great builders, Jayavarman, Yashovarman, Indravarman, Suryavarman. The capital became famous in Asia and was known as Angkor the Magnificent, a city of 1 million inhabitants, larger and more splendid than the Rome of the Caesars. Near the city stood the vast temple of Angkor Wat. The Empire of Cambodia flourished till the end of the 13th century, and the account of a Chinese envoy who visited it in 1297 describes the wealth and splendor of its capital. But suddenly it collapsed, so suddenly that some buildings were left unfinished. There were external attacks and internal troubles, but the major disaster seems to have been the silting up of the Mekong River, which converted the approaches to the city into marshlands and led to its abandonment. Java also broke away from the Sailendra Empire in the 9th century, but even so the Sailendras continued as the leading power in Indonesia till the 11th century, when they came into conflict with the Chola power of South India. The Cholas were victorious and held sway over large parts of Indonesia for over 50 years. On the withdrawal of the Cholas, the Sailendras recovered and continued as an independent state for nearly 300 years more. But it was no longer the dominant power in the eastern seas, and in the 13th century began the disruption of its empire. Java grew at its expense, as also did the Thais, Siam. In the second half of the 14th century Java completely conquered the Sailendra Empire of Srivijaya. This Javan state, which now rose into prominence, had a long history behind it. It was a Brahminical state which had continued its attachment to the older faith in spite of the spread of Buddhism. It had resisted the political and economic sway of the Sailendra Empire of Srivijaya even when more than half of Java itself was occupied by the latter. It consisted of a community of seafaring folk intent on trade and passionately fond of building great structures in stone. Originally it was called the Kingdom of Singasari, but in 1292 a new city, Majapahit, was founded, and from this grew the Empire of Majapahit, which succeeded Srivijaya as the dominant power in Southeast Asia. Majapahit insulted some Chinese envoys sent by Kublai Khan and was punished for this by a Chinese expedition. Probably the Javanese learnt from the Chinese the use of gunpowder, and this helped them finally to defeat the Sailendras. Majapahit was a highly centralized, expanding empire. Its system of taxation is said to have been very well organized, and special attention was paid to trade and its colonies. There was a commerce department of government, a colonial department, and departments for public health, war, the interior, etc. There was also a Supreme Court of Justice consisting of a number of judges. It is astonishing how well this imperialist state was organized. Its chief business was trade from India to China. One of its well-known rulers was the Queen Suhita. The war between Majapahit and Srivijaya was a very cruel one, and though it ended in the complete victory of the former, it sowed the seeds of fresh conflict. From the ruins of the Sailendra power, allied to other elements, notably Arabs and Muslim converts, rose the Malaya power in Sumatra and Malacca. The command of the eastern seas, which had so long been held by South India or the Indian colonies, now passed to the Arabs. Malacca rose into prominence as a great center of trade and seat of political power, and Islam spread over the Malay Peninsula and the islands. It was this new power that finally put an end to Majapahit towards the end of the 15th century. But within a few years, in 1511, the Portuguese, under Albuquerque, came and took possession of Malacca. Europe had reached the Far East through her newly developing sea power. End of Part 16, titled, Indian Colonies and Culture in Southeast Asia, of Chapter 5. Part 17, The Influence of Indian Art Abroad. These records of ancient empires and dynasties have an interest for the antiquarian, but they have a large interest in the history of civilization and art. From the point of view of India they are particularly important, for it was India that functioned there and exhibited her vitality and genius in a variety of ways. We see her bubbling over with energy and spreading out far and wide, carrying not only her thought but her other ideals, her art, her trade, her language and literature, and her methods of government. She was not stagnant, or standing aloof, or isolated and cut off by mountain and sea. Her people crossed those high mountain barriers and perilous seas and built up, as M. Rini Grousset says, a greater India politically as little organized as Greater Greece, but morally equally harmonious. As a matter of fact, even the political organization of these Malaysian states was of a high order, though it was not part of the Indian political structure. But M. Grousset refers to the wider areas where Indian culture spread, in the high plateau of eastern Iran, in the oases of Serindia, in the arid wastes of Tibet, Mongolia, and Manchuria, in the ancient civilized lands of China and Japan, in the lands of the primitive Mons and Khmers and other tribes in Indochina, in the countries of the Malayo-Polynesians, in Indonesia and Malay. India left the indelible impress of her high culture, not only upon religion, but also upon art and literature, in a word, all the higher things of spirit. Footnote: Civilizations of the East by Rini Grousset, Volume 2, page 276. End of footnote. Indian civilization took root especially in the countries of Southeast Asia, and the evidence for this can be found all over the place today. There were great centers of Sanskrit learning in Champa, Angkor, Srivijaya, Majapahit, and other places. The names of the rulers of the various states and empires that arose are purely Indian and Sanskrit. This does not mean that they were pure Indian, but it does mean that they were Indianized. State ceremonies were Indian and conducted in Sanskrit. All the officers of the state bear old Sanskrit titles, and some of these titles and designations have been continued up till now, not only in Thailand but in the Muslim states of Malaya. The old literatures of these places in Indonesia are full of Indian myth and legend. The famous dances of Java and Bali derive from India. The little island of Bali has indeed largely maintained its old Indian culture down to modern times, and even Hinduism has persisted there. The art of writing went to the Philippines from India. In Cambodia the alphabet is derived from South India, and numerous Sanskrit words have been taken over with minor variations. The civil and criminal law is based on the laws of Manum, the ancient lawgiver of India, and this has been codified, with variations due to Buddhist influence, in modern Cambodian legislation. Footnote: From A. Leclerc's Recherches sur les origines brahmaniques des lois cambodgiennes, quoted in B. R. Chatterjee's Indian Cultural Influence in Cambodia, published in Calcutta, 1928. End of footnote. But above all else, it is in the magnificent art and architecture of these old Indian colonies that the Indian influence is most marked. The original impulse was modified, adapted, and fused with the genius of the place, and out of this fusion arose the monuments and wonderful temples of Angkor and Borobudur. At Borobudur in Java the whole life story of Buddha is carved in stone. At other places bas reliefs reproduce the legends of Vishnu and Rama and Krishna. Of Angkor, Mr. Osbert Sitwell has written, "Let it be said immediately that Angkor, as it stands, ranks as chief wonder of the world today, one of the summits to which human genius has aspired in stone, infinitely more impressive, lovely and, as well, romantic, than anything that can be seen in China. The material remains of a civilization that flashed its wings, of the utmost brilliance, for 6 centuries, and then perished so utterly that even his name has died from the lips of man." Round the great temple of Angkor Wat is a vast area of mighty ruins with artificial lakes and pools, and canals and bridges over them, and a great gate dominated by a vast sculptured head, a lovely, smiling but enigmatic Cambodian face, though one raised to the power and beauty of a god. The face with its strangely fascinating and disturbing smile, the Angkor smile, is repeated again and again. This gate leads to the temple. The neighboring Bayon can be said to be the most imaginative and singular in the world, more lovely than Angkor Wat, because more unearthly in its conception, a temple from a city in some other distant planet. Imbued with the same elusive beauty that often lives between the lines of a great poem. Footnote: These extracts have been taken from Osbert Sitwell's Escape with Me, an Oriental sketchbook, published in 1941. End of footnote. The inspiration for Angkor came from India, but it was the Khmer genius that developed it, or the two fused together and produced this wonder. The Cambodian king who is said to have built this great temple is named Jayavarman VII, a typical Indian name. Dr. Quaritch Wales says that when the guiding hand of India was removed, her inspiration was not forgotten, but the Khmer genius was released to mold from it vast new conceptions of amazing vitality different from, and hence not properly to be compared with anything matured in a purely Indian environment. It is true that Khmer culture is essentially based on the inspiration of India, without which the Khmers at best might have produced nothing greater than the barbaric splendor of the Central American Mayas, but it must be admitted that here, more than anywhere else in Greater India, this inspiration fell on fertile soil. Footnote, from Towards Encore by Dr. H. G. Quaritch Wales, published by Harrop, 1933. End of footnote. This leads one to think that in India itself that original inspiration gradually faded because the mind and the soil became overworked and undernourished for lack of fresh currents and ideas. So long as India kept her mind open and gave of her riches to others, and received from them what she lacked, she remained fresh and strong and vital. But the more she withdrew into her shell, intent on preserving herself, uncontaminated by external influences, the more she lost that inspiration and her life became increasingly a dull round of meaningless activities all centered in the dead past. Losing the art of creating beauty, her children lost even the capacity to recognize it. It is to European scholars and archaeologists that the excavations and discoveries in Java, Angkor and elsewhere in Greater India are due, more especially to French and Dutch scholars. Great cities and monuments probably still lie buried there awaiting discovery. Meanwhile, it is said that important sites in Malaya containing ancient ruins have been destroyed by mining operations or for obtaining material for building roads. The war will no doubt add to this destruction. Some years ago I had a letter from a Thai, Siamese, student who had come to Tagore's Shanti Niketan and was returning to Thailand. He wrote, "I always consider myself exceptionally fortunate in being able to come to this great and ancient land of Aryavurta and to pay my humble homage at the feet of Grandmother India, in whose affectionate arms my mother country was so lovingly brought up and taught to appreciate and love what was sublime and beautiful in culture and religion." This may not be typical, but it does convey some idea of the general feeling towards India which, though vague and overladen with much else, still continues in many of the countries of Southeast Asia. Everywhere an intense and narrow nationalism has grown, looking to itself and distrustful of others. There is fear and hatred of European domination and yet a desire to emulate Europe and America. There is often some contempt for India because of her dependent condition, and yet behind all this there is a feeling of respect and friendship for India, for old memories endure and people have not forgotten that there was a time when India was a mother country to these and nourished them with rich fare from her own treasure house. Just as Hellenism spread from Greece to the countries of the Mediterranean and in Western Asia, India's cultural influence spread to many countries and left its powerful impress upon them. From Persia to the Chinese Sea, writes Sylvain Levi, from the icy regions of Siberia to the islands of Java and Borneo, from Oceania to Socotra, India has propagated her beliefs, her tales and her civilization. She has left indelible imprints on 1/4 of the human race in the course of a long succession of centuries. She has the right to reclaim in universal history the rank that ignorance has refused her for a long time and to hold her place amongst the great nations, summarizing and symbolizing the spirit of humanity. Footnote, quoted in V. N. Gasal's Progress of Greater Indian Research, 1917 to 1942, published in Calcutta, 1943. End of footnote. End of Part 17, titled, The Influence of Indian Art Abroad, of Chapter 5. Part 18, Old Indian Art. The amazing expansion of Indian culture and art to other countries has led to some of the finest expressions of this art being found outside India. Unfortunately, many of our old monuments and sculptures, especially in northern India, have been destroyed in the course of ages. To know Indian art in India alone, says Sir John Marshall, is to know but half its story. To apprehend it to the full, we must follow it in the wake of Buddhism, to Central Asia, China, and Japan. We must watch it assuming new forms and breaking into new beauties as it spreads over Tibet and Burma and Siam. We must gaze in awe at the unexampled grandeur of its creations in Cambodia and Java. In each of these countries, Indian art encounters a different racial genius, a different local environment, and under their modifying influence it takes on a different garb. Footnote, from Forward to Reginald LeMay's Buddhist Art in Siam, published in Cambridge, 1938, quoted by Gasal in Progress of Greater Indian Research, published in Calcutta, 1943. End of footnote. Indian art is so intimately associated with Indian religion and philosophy that it is difficult to appreciate it fully unless one has some knowledge of the ideals that govern the Indian mind. In art, as in music, there is a gulf which separates Eastern from Western conceptions. Probably the great artists and builders of the Middle Ages in Europe would have felt more in tune with Indian art and sculpture than modern European artists who derive part of their inspiration at least from the Renaissance period and after. For in Indian art there is always a religious urge, a looking beyond, such as probably inspired the builders of the great cathedrals of Europe. Beauty is conceived as subjective, not objective. It is a thing of the spirit, though it may also take lovely shape in form or matter. The Greeks loved beauty for its own sake and found not only joy but truth in it. The ancient Indians loved beauty also, but always they sought to put some deeper significance in their work, some vision of the inner truth as they saw it. In the supreme examples of their creative work they extort admiration, even though one may not understand what they were aiming at or the ideas that governed them. In lesser examples, this lack of understanding, of not being in tune with the artist's mind, becomes a bar to appreciation. There is a vague feeling of discomfort, even of irritation, at something one cannot grasp, and this leads to the conclusion that the artist did not know his job and has failed. Sometimes there is even a feeling of repulsion. I know nothing about art, Eastern or Western, and am not competent to say anything about it. I react to it as any untutored layman might do. Some painting or sculpture or building fills me with delight, or moves me and makes me feel a strange emotion, or it just pleases me a little, or it does not affect me at all and I pass it by almost unnoticed, or it repels me. I cannot explain these reactions or speak learnedly about the merits or demerits of works of art. The Buddhist statue, at an Aradapud, in Ceylon, moved me greatly, and a picture of it has been my companion for many years. On the other hand, some famous temples in South India, heavy with carving and detail, disturb me and fill me with unease. Europeans, trained in the Greek tradition, at first examined Indian art from the Grecian point of view. They recognized something they knew in the Greco-Buddhist art of Gandhara and the frontier and considered other forms in India as degraded types of this. Gradually a new approach was made and it was pointed out that Indian art was something original and vital and in no way derived from this Greco-Buddhist art, which was a pale reflection of it. This new approach came more from the continent of Europe than from England. It is curious that Indian art, and this applies to Sanskrit literature also, has been more appreciated on the continent than in England. I have often wondered how far this has been conditioned by the unfortunate political relationship existing between India and England. Probably there is something in that, though there must be other and more basic causes of difference also. There are of course many Englishmen, artists and scholars and others, who have come near to the spirit and outlook of India and helped to discover our old treasures and interpret them to the world. There are many also to whom India is grateful for their warm friendship and service. Yet the fact remains that there is a gulf, and an ever-widening gulf, between Indians and Englishmen. On the Indian side this is easier to understand, at any rate for me, for a great deal has happened in recent years that has cut deep into our souls. On the other side perhaps some similar reactions have taken place for different reasons, among them, anger at being put in the wrong before the world when, according to them, the fault was not theirs. But the feeling is deeper than politics and it comes out unawares, and most of all it seems to affect English intellectuals. The Indian, to them, appears to be a special manifestation of original sin and all his works bear this mark. A popular English author, though hardly representative of English thought or intelligence, has recently written a book which is full of a malicious hatred and disgust for almost everything Indian. A more eminent and representative English author, Mr. Osbert Sitwell, says in his book Escape with Me, 1941, that the idea of India, despite its manifold and diverse marvels, continued to be repellent. He refers also to that repulsive, greasy quality that so often mars Hindu works of art. Mr. Sitwell is perfectly justified in holding those opinions about Indian art or India generally. I am sure he feels that way. I am myself repelled by much in India, but I do not feel that way about India as a whole. Naturally, for I am an Indian and I cannot easily hate myself, however unworthy I may be. But it is not a question of opinions or views on art, it is much more a conscious and subconscious dislike and unfriendliness to a whole people. Is it true that those whom we have injured, we dislike and hate? Among the Englishmen who have appreciated Indian art and applied new standards of judgment to it have been Lawrence Binyon and E. B. Havell. Havell is particularly enthusiastic about the ideals of Indian art and the spirit underlying them. He emphasizes that a great national art affords an intimate revelation of national thought and character, but it is only to be appreciated if the ideals behind it are understood. An alien governing race misapprehending and depreciating those ideals sows the seeds of intellectual antipathy. Indian art, he says, was not addressed to a narrow coterie of literati. Its intention was to make the central ideas of religion and philosophy intelligible to the masses. That Hindu art was successful in its educational purpose may be inferred from the fact, known to all who have intimate acquaintance with Indian life, that the Indian peasantry, though illiterate in the Western sense, are among the most cultured of their class anywhere in the world. Footnote, from E.B. Havel's The Ideals of Indian Art, published in 1920, pages 19 of first section and 212. End of footnote. In art, as in Sanskrit poetry and Indian music, the artist was supposed to identify himself with nature in all her moods, to express the essential harmony of man with nature and the universe. That has been the keynote of all Asiatic art, and it is because of this that there is a certain unity about the art of Asia, in spite of its great variety and the national differences that are so evident. There is not much of old painting in India, except for the lovely frescoes of Ajanta. Perhaps much of it has perished. It was in her sculpture and architecture that India stood out, just as China and Japan excelled in painting. Indian music, which is so different from European music, was highly developed in its own way, and India stood out in this respect and influenced Asiatic music considerably, except for China and the Far East. Music thus became another link with Persia, Afghanistan, Arabia, Turkestan and, to some extent, in other areas where Arab civilization flourished, for instance, North Africa. Indian classical music will probably be appreciated in all these countries. An important influence in the development of art in India, as elsewhere in Asia, was the religious prejudice against graven images. The Vedas were against image worship, and it was only at a comparatively late period in Buddhism that Buddha's person was represented in sculpture and painting. In the Mataram Museum there is a huge stone figure of the Bodhisattva which is full of strength and power. This belongs to the Kushan period, about the beginning of the Christian era. The early period of Indian art is full of a naturalism which may partly be due to Chinese influences. Chinese influence is visible at various stages of Indian art history, chiefly in the development of this naturalism, just as Indian idealism went to China and Japan and powerfully influenced them during some of their great periods. During the Gupta period, 4th to 6th centuries AC, the Golden Age of India as it is called, the caves of Ajanta were dug out and the frescoes painted. Bagh and Badami are also of this period. The Ajanta frescoes, very beautiful though they are, have, ever since their discovery, exercised a powerful influence on our present-day artists, who have turned away from life and sought to model their style on that of Ajanta, with unhappy results. Ajanta takes one back into some distant dreamlike and yet very real world. These frescoes were painted by the Buddhist monks. "Keep away from women, do not even look at them, for they are dangerous," has said their master long ago. And yet we have here women in plenty, beautiful women, princesses, singers, dancers, seated and standing, beautifying themselves, or in procession. The women of Ajanta had become famous. How well those painter monks must have known the world and the moving drama of life, how lovingly they have painted it, just as they have painted the Bodhisattva in his calm and otherworldly majesty. In the 7th and 8th centuries the mighty caves of Ellora were carved out of solid rock with the stupendous Kailasa temple in the center. It is difficult to imagine how human beings conceived this or, having conceived it, gave body and shape to their conception. The caves of Elephanta, with the powerful and subtle Trimurti, date also from this period. Also the group of monuments at Mamallapuram in South India. In the Elephanta caves there is a broken statue of Shiva Nataraja, Shiva dancing. Even in its mutilated condition, Havel says that it is a majestic conception and an embodiment of titanic power. Though the rock itself seems to vibrate with the rhythmic movement of the dance, the noble head bears the same look of serene calm and dispassion which illuminate the face of the Buddha. There is another Shiva Nataraja in the British Museum, and of this Epstein has written, "Shiva dances, creating the world and destroying it, his large rhythms conjure up vast eons of time, and his movements have a relentless magical power of incantation." A small group of the British Museum is the most tragic summing up of the death in love motive ever seen, and it epitomizes, as no other work, the fatal element in human passion. Our European allegories are banal and pointless by comparison with these profound works, devoid of the trappings of symbolism, concentrating on the essential, the essentially plastic. Footnote, from Epstein's Let There Be Sculpture, published in 1942, page 193. End of footnote. There is a head of a bodhisattva from Borobudur in Java which has been taken to the Glyptotek in Copenhagen. It is beautiful, in the sense of formal beauty, but, as Havel says, there is something deeper in it revealing, as in a mirror, the pure soul of the bodhisattva. It is a face which incarnates the stillness of the depths of the ocean, the serenity of an azure, cloudless sky, a beatitude beyond mortal ken. Indian art in Java, adds Havel, has a character of its own which distinguishes it from that of the continent from whence it came. There runs through both the same strain of deep serenity, but in the divine ideal of Java we lose the austere feeling which characterizes the Hindu sculpture of Elephanta and Mamallapuram. There is more of human contentment and joy in Indo-Javanese art, an expression of that peaceful security which the Indian colonists enjoyed in their happy island home, after the centuries of storm and struggle which their forefathers had experienced on the mainland. Footnote: Havel's The Ideals of Indian Art, 1920, page 169. End of footnote. End of Part 18, titled, Old Indian Art, of Chapter 5. Part 19, India's Foreign Trade. Throughout the first millennium of the Christian era, India's trade was widespread and Indian merchants controlled many foreign markets. It was dominant in the eastern seas and it reached out also to the Mediterranean. Pepper and other spices went from India or via India to the west, often on Indian and Chinese bottoms, and it is said that Alaric the Goth took away 3,000 pounds of pepper from Rome. Roman writers bemoaned the fact that gold flowed from Rome to India and the East in exchange for various luxury articles. This trade was largely, in India as elsewhere at the time, one of give and take of materials found and developed locally. India was a fertile land and rich in some of the materials that other countries lacked, and the seas being open to her she sent these materials abroad. She also obtained them from the eastern islands and profited as a merchant carrier. But she had further advantages. She had been manufacturing cloth from the earliest ages, long before other countries did so, and a textile industry had developed. Indian textiles went to far countries. Silk was also made from very early times, though probably it was not nearly as good as Chinese silk, which began to be imported as early as the 4th century BC. The Indian silk industry may have developed subsequently, though it does not seem to have gone far. An important advance was made in the dyeing of cloth and special methods were discovered for the preparation of fast dyes. Among these was indigo, a word derived from India through Greece. It was probably this knowledge of dyeing that gave a great impetus to India's trade with foreign countries. Chemistry in India in the early centuries AC was probably more advanced than in other countries. I do not know much about it, but there is a history of Hindu chemistry written by the doyen of Indian chemists and scientists, Sir P.C. Ray, who trained several generations of Indian scientists. Chemistry then was closely allied to alchemy and metallurgy. A famous Indian chemist and metallurgist was named Nagarjuna, and the similarity of the names has led some people to suggest that he was the same person as the great philosopher of the 1st century AC, but this is very doubtful. The tempering of steel was known early in India, and Indian steel and iron were valued abroad, especially for warlike purposes. Many other metals were known and used, and preparations of metallic compounds were made for medicinal purposes. Distillation and calcination were well known. The science of medicine was fairly well developed. Though based mainly on the old textbooks, considerable experimental progress was made right up to the medieval period. Anatomy and physiology were studied and the circulation of the blood was suggested long before Harvey. Astronomy, oldest of sciences, was a regular subject of the university curriculum, and with it was mixed up astrology. A very accurate calendar was worked out, and this calendar is still in popular use. It is a solar calendar having lunar months, which leads to periodical adjustments. As elsewhere, the priests, or Brahmins, were especially concerned with this calendar, and they fixed the seasonal festivals as well as indicated the exact time of the eclipses of the sun and moon, which were also in the nature of festivals. They took advantage of this knowledge to encourage among the masses beliefs and observances, which they must have known to be superstitious, and thus added to their own prestige. A knowledge of astronomy, in its practical aspects, was of great help to the people who went on the seas. The ancient Indians were rather proud of the advances they had made in astronomical knowledge. They had contacts with Arab astronomy, which was largely based on Alexandria. It is difficult to say how far mechanical appliances had developed then, but shipbuilding was a flourishing industry, and there is frequent reference to various kinds of machines, especially for purposes of war. This has led some enthusiastic and rather credulous Indians to imagine all kinds of complicated machines. It does seem, however, that India at that time was not behind any country in the making and use of tools and in the knowledge of chemistry and metallurgy. It was this that gave her an advantage in trade and enabled her for several centuries to control a number of foreign markets. Possibly she had one other advantage also, the absence of slave labor, which handicapped Greek and other early civilizations and came in the way of their progress. The caste system, with all its evils, which progressively increased, was infinitely better than slavery even for those lowest in the scale. Within each caste there was equality and a measure of freedom. Each caste was occupational and applied itself to its own particular work. This led to a high degree of specialization and skill in handicrafts and craftsmanship. End of Part 19, titled, India's Foreign Trade, of Chapter 5. Part 20, Mathematics in Ancient India. Highly intellectual and given to abstract thinking as they were, one would expect the ancient Indians to excel in mathematics. Europe got its early arithmetic and algebra from the Arabs, hence the Arabic numerals, but the Arabs themselves had previously taken them from India. The astonishing progress that the Indians had made in mathematics is now well known, and it is recognized that the foundations of modern arithmetic and algebra were laid long ago in India. The clumsy method of using a counting frame and the use of Roman and such-like numerals had long retarded progress when the 10 Indian numerals, including the zero sign, liberated the human mind from these restrictions and threw a flood of light on the behavior of numbers. These number symbols were unique and entirely different from all other symbols that had been in use in other countries. They are common enough today and we take them for granted, yet they contained the germs of revolutionary progress in them. It took many centuries for them to travel from India, via Baghdad, to the Western world. 150 years ago, during Napoleon's time, Laplace wrote, "It is India that gave us the ingenious method of expressing all numbers by means of 10 symbols, each symbol receiving a value of position, as well as an absolute value, a profound and important idea which appears so simple to us now that we ignore its true merit, but its very simplicity, the great ease which it has lent to all computations, puts our arithmetic in the first rank of useful inventions, and we shall appreciate the grandeur of this achievement when we remember that it escaped the genius of Archimedes and Apollonius, two of the greatest men produced by antiquity." Footnote, quoted in Hogben's Mathematics for the Million, published in London, 1942. End of footnote. The origins of geometry, arithmetic, and algebra in India go back to remote periods. Probably to begin with there was some kind of geometrical algebra used for making figures for Vedic altars. Mention is made in the most ancient books of the geometrical method for the transformation of a square into a rectangle having a given side, ax equals c. Geometrical figures are even now commonly used in Hindu ceremonies. Geometry made progress in India, but in this respect Greece and Alexandria went ahead. It was in arithmetic and algebra that India kept the lead. The inventor or inventors of the decimal place value system and the zero mark are not known. The earliest use of the zero symbol, so far discovered, is in one of the scriptural books, dated about 200 BC. It is considered probable that the place value system was invented about the beginning of the Christian era. The zero, called shunya or nothing, was originally a dot and later it became a small circle. It was considered a number like any other. Professor Halstead thus emphasizes the vital significance of this invention. The importance of the creation of the zero mark can never be exaggerated. This giving to airy nothing, not merely a local habitation and a name, a picture, a symbol but helpful power, is the characteristic of the Hindu race from whence it sprang. It is like coining the nirvana into dynamos. No single mathematical creation has been more potent for the general on-go of intelligence and power. Footnote, from G. B. Halstead's, On the Foundation and Technique of Arithmetic, page 20 published in Chicago, 1912, quoted in History of Hindu Mathematics by B. Datta and A. N. Singh, 1935. End of footnote. Yet another modern mathematician has grown eloquent over this historic event. Danzig in his number writes, "This long period of nearly 5,000 years saw the rise and fall of many a civilization, each leaving behind it a heritage of literature, art, philosophy, and religion. But what was the net achievement in the field of reckoning, the earliest art practiced by man? An inflexible numeration so crude as to make progress well nigh impossible, and a calculating device so limited in scope that even elementary calculations called for the services of an expert. Man used these devices for thousands of years without making a single worthwhile improvement in the instrument, without contributing a single important idea to the system. Even when compared with the slow growth of ideas during the Dark Ages, the history of reckoning presents a peculiar picture of desolate stagnation. When viewed in this light, the achievements of the unknown Hindu, who sometime in the first centuries of our era discovered the principle of position, assumes the importance of a world event. Footnote, quoted in L. Hogben's Mathematics for the Million, published in London, 1942. End of footnote. Danzig is puzzled at the fact that the great mathematicians of Greece did not stumble on this discovery. Is it that the Greeks had such a marked contempt for applied science, leaving even the instruction of their children to slaves? But if so, how is it that the nation that gave us geometry and carried this science so far did not create even a rudimentary algebra? Is it not equally strange that algebra, that cornerstone of modern mathematics, also originated in India, and at about the same time that positional numeration did? The answer to this question is suggested by Professor Hogben: the difficulty of understanding why it should have been the Hindus who took this step, why it was not taken by the mathematicians of antiquity, why it should first have been taken by practical man, is only insuperable if we seek for the explanation of intellectual progress in the genius of a few gifted individuals, instead of in the whole social framework of custom thought which circumscribes the greatest individual genius. What happened in India about AD 100 had happened before. Maybe it is happening now in Soviet Russia. To accept it, this truth, is to recognize that every culture contains within itself its own doom, unless it pays as much attention to the education of the mass of mankind as to the education of the exceptionally gifted people. Footnote, Hogben's Mathematics for the Million, published in London, 1942, page 285. End of footnote. We must assume then that these momentous inventions were not just due to the momentary illumination of an erratic genius, much in advance of his time, but that they were essentially the product of the social milieu and that they answered some insistent demand of the times. Genius of a high order was certainly necessary to find this out and fulfill the demand, but if the demand had not been there, the urge to find some way out would have been absent, and even if the invention had been made, it would have been forgotten or put aside till circumstances more propitious for its use arose. It seems clear from the early Sanskrit works on mathematics that the demand was there, for these books are full of problems of trade and social relationship involving complicated calculations. There are problems dealing with taxation, debt, and interest, problems of partnership, barter and exchange, and the calculation of the fineness of gold. Society had grown complex and large numbers of people were engaged in governmental operations and in an extensive trade. It was impossible to carry on without simple methods of calculation. The adoption of zero, and the decimal place value system in India, unbarred the gates of the mind to rapid progress in arithmetic and algebra. Fractions come in, and the multiplication and division of fractions, the rule of 3 is discovered and perfected, squares and square roots, together with the sign of the square root, cubes and cube roots, the minus sign, tables of signs, pi is evaluated as 3.1416, letters of the alphabet are used in algebra to denote unknowns, simple and quadratic equations are considered, the mathematics of zero are investigated. 0 is defined as a minus a equals 0, a plus 0 equals a minus 0 equals a multiplied by 0 equals 0, a divided by 0 becomes infinity. The conception of negative quantities also comes in, thus, under root 4 equals plus or minus 2. These and other advances in mathematics are contained in books written by a succession of eminent mathematicians from the 5th to the 12th century AC. There are earlier books also, Baudhayana, 8th century BC, Upstamba, and Katyayana, both 5th century BC, which deal with geometrical problems, especially with triangles, rectangles, and squares. But the earliest extant book on algebra is by the famous astronomer, Aryabhat, who was born in AC 476. He wrote this book on astronomy and mathematics when he was only 23 years old. Aryabhat, who is sometimes called the inventor of algebra, must have relied, partly at least, on the work of his predecessors. The next great name in Indian mathematics is that of Bhaskar I, AC 522, and he was followed by Brahmagupta, AC 628, who was also a famous astronomer, and who stated the laws applying to shunya or zero and made other notable advances. There follow a succession of mathematicians who have written on arithmetic or algebra. The last great name is that of Bhaskar II, who was born in AC 1114. He wrote 3 books, on astronomy, algebra, and arithmetic. His book on arithmetic is known as Leelavati, which is an odd name for a treatise on mathematics, as it is the name of a woman. There are frequent references in the book to a young girl who is addressed as O Leelavati and is then instructed on the problems stated. It is believed, without any definite proof, that Leelavati was Bhaskara's daughter. The style of the book is clear and simple and suitable for young persons to understand. The book is still used, partly for its style, in Sanskrit schools. Books on mathematics continued to appear, Narayana 1150, Ganesha 1545, but these are mere repetitions of what had been done. Very little original work on mathematics was done in India after the 12th century till we reach the modern age. In the 8th century, during the reign of the Caliph al-Mansud, 753 to 774, a number of Indian scholars went to Baghdad, and among the books they took with them were works on mathematics and astronomy. Probably even earlier than this, Indian numerals had reached Baghdad, but this was the first systematic approach, and Aryabhata's and other books were translated into Arabic. They influenced the development of mathematics and astronomy in the Arab world, and Indian numerals were introduced. Baghdad was then a great center of learning, and Greek and Jewish scholars had gathered there, bringing with them Greek philosophy, geometry, and science. The cultural influence of Baghdad was felt throughout the Muslim world from Central Asia to Spain, and a knowledge of Indian mathematics and their Arabic translations spread all over this vast area. The numerals were called by the Arabs figures of Hind, or India, and the Arabic word for a number is Hindasa, meaning from Hind. From this Arab world the new mathematics traveled to European countries, probably through the Moorish universities of Spain, and became the foundation for European mathematics. There was opposition in Europe to the use of the new numbers, as they were considered infidel symbols, and it took several hundred years before they were in common use. The earliest known use is in a Sicilian coin of 1134, in Britain the first use is in 1490. It seems clear that some knowledge of Indian mathematics, and especially of the place value system of numbers, had penetrated into Western Asia even before the formal embassy carried books to Baghdad. There is an interesting passage in a complaint made by a Syrian scholar monk who was hurt at the arrogance of some Greek scholars who looked down on Syrians. Severus Sabakht was his name, and he lived in a convent situated on the Euphrates. He writes in AC 662 and tries to show that the Syrians were in no way inferior to the Greeks. By way of illustration he refers to the Indians. I will omit all discussion of the science of the Hindus, a people not the same as the Syrians, their subtle discoveries in the science of astronomy, discoveries that are more ingenious than those of the Greeks and the Babylonians, their computing that surpasses description. I wish only to say that this computation is done by means of 9 signs. If those who believe, because they speak Greek, that they have reached the limits of science, should know of these things, they would be convinced that there are also others who know something. Footnote, quoted in History of Hindu Mathematics by B. Datta, and A. N. Singh, 1933. I am indebted to this book for much information on this subject. End of footnote. Mathematics in India inevitably makes one think of one extraordinary figure of recent times. This was Srinivas Ramanujam. Born in a poor Brahmin family in South India, having no opportunities for a proper education, he became a clerk in the Madras Port Trust. But he was bubbling over with some irrepressible quality of instinctive genius and played about with numbers and equations in his spare time. By a lucky chance he attracted the attention of a mathematician who sent some of his amateur work to Cambridge in England. People there were impressed and a scholarship was arranged for him. So he left his clerk's job and went to Cambridge, and during a very brief period there did work of profound value and amazing originality. The Royal Society of England went rather out of their way and made him a fellow, but he died 2 years later, probably of tuberculosis, at the age of 33. Professor Julian Huxley has, I believe, referred to him somewhere as the greatest mathematician of the century. Ramanujam's brief life and death are symbolic of conditions in India. Of our millions, how few get any education at all, how many live on the verge of starvation, of even those who get some education how many have nothing to look forward to but a clerkship in some office on a pay that is usually far less than the unemployment dole in England. If life opened its gates to them and offered them food and healthy conditions of living and education and opportunities of growth, how many among these millions would be eminent scientists, educationists, technicians, industrialists, writers and artists, helping to build a new India and a new world? End of Part 20, titled, Mathematics in Ancient India, of Chapter 5. Part 21, Growth and Decay. During the first 1,000 years of the Christian era, there are many ups and downs in India, many conflicts with invading elements and internal troubles. Yet it is a period of a vigorous national life, bubbling over with energy and spreading out in all directions. Culture develops into a rich civilization flowering out in philosophy, literature, drama, art, science, and mathematics. India's economy expands, the Indian horizon widens, and other countries come within its scope. Contacts grow with Iran, China, the Hellenic world, Central Asia, and above all, there is a powerful urge towards the eastern seas which leads to the establishment of Indian colonies and the spread of Indian culture far beyond India's boundaries. During the middle period of this millennium, from early in the 4th to the 6th century, the Gupta Empire flourishes and becomes the patron and symbol of this widespread intellectual and artistic activity. It is called the Golden or Classical Age of India, and the writings of that period, which are classics in Sanskrit literature, reveal a serenity, a quiet confidence of the people in themselves, and a glow of pride at being privileged to be alive in that high noon of civilization, and with it the urge to use their great intellectual and artistic powers to the utmost. Yet even before that golden age had come to a close, signs of weakness and decay become visible. The White Huns come from the northwest in successive hordes and are repeatedly pushed back. But they come again and again and eat their way slowly into North India. For a half-century they even established themselves as a ruling power all over the north. But then, with a great effort, the last of the great Guptas, joining up in a confederacy with Yashovarman, a ruler of central India, drives out the Huns. This long drawn-out conflict weakened India politically and militarily, and probably the settlement of large numbers of these Huns all over northern India gradually produced an inner change in the people. They were absorbed as all foreign elements had so far been absorbed, but they left their impress and weakened the old ideals of the Indo-Aryan races. Old accounts of the Huns are full of their excessive cruelty and barbarous behavior which were so foreign to Indian standards of warfare and government. In the 7th century there was a revival and renaissance under Harsha, both political and cultural. Ujjaini, modern Ujjain, which had been the brilliant capital of the Guptas, again became a center of art and culture and the seat of a powerful kingdom. But in the centuries that followed, this too weakens and fades off. In the 9th century, Mihira Bhoj, of Gujarat, consolidates a unified state in north and central India with his capital at Kannauj. There is another literary revival of which the central figure is Rajshekhar. Again, at the beginning of the 11th century, another Bhoja stands out as a powerful and attractive figure, and Ujjaini again becomes a great capital. This Bhoja was a remarkable man who distinguished himself in many fields. He was a grammarian and a lexicographer, and interested in medicine and astronomy. He was a builder and a patron of art and literature, and was himself a poet and a writer to whom many works are attributed. His name has become a part of popular fable and legend as a symbol of greatness, learning, and generosity. And yet for all these bright patches, an inner weakness seems to seize India, which affects not only her political status but her creative activities. There is no date for this, for the process was a slow and creeping one, and it affected North India earlier than the South. The South indeed becomes more important both politically and culturally. Perhaps this was due to the South having escaped the continuous strain of fighting waves of invaders. Perhaps many of the writers and artists and master builders migrated to the South to escape from the unsettled conditions in the North. The powerful kingdoms of the South, with their brilliant courts, must have attracted these people and given them opportunities for creative work which they lacked elsewhere. But though the North did not dominate India, as it had often done in the past, and was split up into small states, life was still rich there and there were many centers of cultural and philosophic activity. Benares, as ever, was the heart of religious and philosophical thought, and every person who advanced a new theory or a new interpretation of an old theory had to come there to justify himself. Kashmir was for long a great Sanskrit center of Buddhist and Brahminical learning. The great universities flourished. Of these, Nalanda, the most famous of all, was respected for its scholarship all over India. To have been to Nalanda was a hallmark of culture. It was not easy to enter that university, for admission was restricted to those who had already attained a certain standard. It specialized in postgraduate study and attracted students from China, Japan, and Tibet, and even, it is said, from Korea and Mongolia and Bukhara. Apart from religious and philosophical subjects, both Buddhist and Brahminical, secular and practical subjects were also taught. There was a school of art and a department for architecture, a medical school, an agricultural department, dairy farms and cattle. The intellectual life of the university is said to have been one of animated debates and discussions. The spread of Indian culture abroad was largely the work of scholars from Nalanda. Then there was the Vikramshala University, near modern Bhagalpur, in Bihar, and Vallabhi, in Katiyavad. During the period of the Guptas, the Ujjaini University rose into prominence. In the south there was the Amravati University. Yet, as the millennium approached its end, all this appears to be the afternoon of a civilization. The glow of the morning had long faded away, high noon was past. In the south there was still vitality and vigor, and this lasted for some centuries more. In the Indian colonies abroad there was aggressive and full-blooded life right up to the middle of the next millennium. But the heart seems to petrify, its beats are slower, and gradually this petrification and decay spread to the limbs. There is no great figure in philosophy after Shankara in the 8th century, though there is a long succession of commentators and dialecticians. Even Shankara came from the south. The sense of curiosity and the spirit of mental adventure give place to a hard and formal logic and a sterile dialectic. Both Brahmanism and Buddhism deteriorate, and degraded forms of worship grow up, especially some varieties of tantric worship and perversions of the yoga system. In literature, Bhavabhuti, 8th century, is the last great figure. Many books continued to be written, but their style becomes more and more involved and intricate. There is neither freshness of thought nor of expression. In mathematics, Bhaskara II, 12th century, is the last great name. In art, E.B. Habel takes us rather beyond this period. He says that the form of expression was not artistically perfected until about the 7th and 8th centuries, when most of the great sculpture and painting in India was produced. From the 7th or 8th to the 14th century, according to him, was the great period of Indian art, corresponding to the highest development of Gothic art in Europe. He adds that it was in the 16th century that the creative impulse of the old Indian art began markedly to diminish. How far this judgment is correct I do not know, but I imagine that even in the field of art it was South India that carried on the old tradition for a longer period than the North. The last of the major emigrations for colonial settlement took place from South India in the 9th century, but the Cholas in the south continued to be a great sea power till the 11th century, when they defeated and conquered Srivijaya. We thus see that India was drying up and losing her creative genius and vitality. The process was a slow one and lasted several centuries, beginning in the north and finally reaching the south. What were the causes of this political decline and cultural stagnation? Was this due to age alone, that seems to attack civilizations as it does individuals, or to a kind of tidal wave with its forward and backward motion? Or were external causes and invasions responsible for it? Radhakrishnan says that Indian philosophy lost its vigor with the loss of political freedom. Sylvain Levy writes, La culture sanskrit a fini avec la liberté de langue, des langues nouvelles, des littératures nouvelles en envahi la territoire ariane et l'en chassé, elle s'est réfugiée dans les collèges et y appris un air pedantesque. All this is true, for the loss of political freedom lead inevitably to cultural decay. But why should political freedom be lost unless some kind of decay has preceded it? A small country might easily be overwhelmed by superior power, but a huge, well-developed and highly civilized country like India cannot succumb to external attack unless there is internal decay, or the invader possesses a higher technique of warfare. That internal decay is clearly evident in India at the close of these 1,000 years. There are repeatedly periods of decay and disruption in the life of every civilization, and there had been such periods in Indian history previously, but India had survived them and rejuvenated herself afresh, sometimes retiring into her shell for a while and emerging again with fresh vigor. There always remained a dynamic core which could renew itself with fresh contacts and develop again, something different from the past and yet intimately connected with it. Had that capacity for adaptation, that flexibility of mind which had saved India so often in the past left her now? Had her fixed beliefs and the growing rigidity of her social structure made her mind also rigid? For if life ceases to grow and evolve, the evolution of thought also ceases. India had all along been a curious combination of conservatism in practice and explosive thought. Inevitably that thought affected the practice, though it did so in its own way without irreverence for the past. Mais si l'or vient les mots anciens, leur intelligence voyait des nouvelles. L'on s'est transformé à son insu. But when thought lost its explosiveness and creative power and became a tame attendant on an outworn and meaningless practice, mumbling old phrases and fearful of everything new, then life became stagnant and tied and constrained in a prison of its own making. We have many examples of the collapse of a civilization, and perhaps the most notable of these is that of the European classical civilization which ended with the fall of Rome. Long before Rome fell to the invaders from the north, it had been on the verge of collapse from its own internal weaknesses. Its economy, once expanding, had shrunk and brought all manner of difficulties in its train. Urban industries decayed, flourishing cities grew progressively smaller and impoverished, and even fertility rapidly declined. The emperors tried many expedients to overcome their ever-increasing difficulties. There was compulsory state regulation of merchants, craftsmen, and workers, who were tied down to particular employments. Many kinds of employment were forbidden to those outside certain groups of workers. Thus some occupations were practically converted into castes. The peasantry became serfs. But all these superficial attempts to check the decline failed and even worsened conditions, and the Roman Empire collapsed. There was and has been no such dramatic collapse of Indian civilization, and it has shown an amazing staying power despite all that has happened, but a progressive decline is visible. It is difficult to specify in any detail what the social conditions in India were at the end of the first millennium after Christ, but it may be said with some assurance that the expanding economy of India had ended and there was a strong tendency to shrink. Probably this was the inevitable result of the growing rigidity and exclusiveness of the Indian social structure as represented chiefly by the caste system. Where Indians had gone abroad, as in Southeast Asia, they were not so rigid in mind or customs or in their economy, and they had opportunities for growth and expansion. For another 400 or 500 years they flourished in these colonies and displayed energy and creative vigor, but in India herself the spirit of exclusiveness sapped the creative faculty and developed a narrow, small group, and parochial outlook. Life became cut up into set frames, where each man's job was fixed and permanent and he had little concern with others. It was the Kshatriya business to fight in defense of the country, and others were not interested, or were not even allowed to do so. The Brahmin and the Kshatriya looked down on trade and commerce. Education and opportunities of growth were withheld from the lower castes, who were taught to be submissive to those higher up in the scale. In spite of a well-developed urban economy and industries, the structure of the state was in many ways feudal. Probably even in the technique of warfare India had fallen behind. No marked progress was possible under these conditions without changing that structure and releasing fresh sources of talent and energy. The caste system was a barrier to such a change. For all its virtues and the stability it had given to Indian society, it carried within it the seeds of destruction. The Indian social structure, and I shall consider this more fully later, had given amazing stability to Indian civilization. It had given strength and cohesion to the group, but this came in the way of expansion and a larger cohesion. It developed crafts and skill in trade and commerce, but always within each group separately. Thus particular types of activity became hereditary and there was a tendency to avoid new types of work and activity and to confine oneself to the old groove, to restrict initiative and the spirit of innovation. It gave a measure of freedom within a certain limited sphere, but at the expense of the growth of a larger freedom and at the heavy price of keeping large numbers of people permanently at the bottom of the social ladder, deprived of the opportunities of growth. So long as that structure afforded avenues for growth and expansion, it was progressive. When it reached the limits of expansion open to it, it became stationary, unprogressive, and, later, inevitably regressive. Because of this there was decline all along the line, intellectual, philosophical, political, in technique and methods of warfare, in knowledge of and contacts with the outside world, and there was a growth of local sentiments and feudal, small group feeling at the expense of the larger conception of India as a whole, and a shrinking economy. Yet, as later ages were to show, there was yet vitality in the old structure and an amazing tenacity, as well as some flexibility and capacity for adaptation. Because of this it managed to survive and to profit by new contacts and waves of thought, and even progress in some ways. But that progress was always tied down to and hampered by far too many relics of the past. End of part 21, titled, Growth and Decay, of chapter 5. This concludes the 5th chapter, titled, Through the Ages, of Nehru's The Discovery of India.